In this fourth part of our second theme, we're going to be looking at how do I identify a research methodology. So how do I go about choosing my method? The first thing is to think about the kind of question that you are asking and the kind of data that you will need to answer the question. Now sit back and think through the process that you need to follow. So map a little bit your process for yourself and ask, where will I get the data? How will I get that data? So how will I use a questionnaire to do it? Will I use an experiment? Will I observe? Can I get enough data? And this is very important, particularly if you want to do statistical analysis. If you have too small a sample or not enough data, you cannot do accurate statistical analysis. And then can I get the right kind of data? Often we end up collecting reams of data, but it's not the data that you need to answer your question. It's very interesting, but it is not relevant. And lastly, how much will this cost me? Because it is important that you understand that to access your data and to collect data can cost a lot of money. You may need to fly to different parts of the country. You may need to pay people to hand out questionnaires for you on the street corner or on the shopping center. Or you may need to buy data from a company such as a research marketing company. So always ask yourself as well, when you think about your methodology, do I have the aptitude for this kind of research? We all have different strengths and weaknesses. If you are useless at statistics and mathematics, don't do the kind of study where you have to do a statistical analysis. If you don't like to talk to people, think carefully about whether you want to do in-depth interviews. If you're scared of picking up the telephone and asking random strangers questions over the telephone and you don't like rejection, reconsider your ideas of doing a telephonic questionnaire, for example. So always think about the kind of person you are, what your skills are, what your strengths and weaknesses are, and how that will help you to do your research. Then ask whether you have the necessary equipment or the facilities. Now, often this can be as simple as a dictaphone. They're fairly inexpensive to buy, or you can rent dictaphones from time to time. Because if you do interviews, you need to record your interviews so that you can transcribe them afterwards. Sometimes you may need to have access to computing power, so you can deal with large metadata. Or you are doing a material test, for example, so you need to have access to a laboratory. So think about whether I can get that facilities, whether it is available at the university or not. Then look at your project again and say, well, how long is it going to take me and how much money is it going to cost me? And can I realistically do this? Can I do it in the time that is available for me to complete this particular study? You also need to ask yourself some questions about the data, such as, very importantly, what data are needed. And this is not such a simple question as it appears to be. Because often, as I said, people end up and they're collecting all kinds of data, but it's not necessarily data that will help them to answer their questions. Once you know what the kind of data is that you need, where are you going to get this data? Does it sit somewhere on somebody's databases? Is it in books? Do you need to interview it because it sits in people's heads? Then how will I secure this data? So that's your tools. Are you going to measure it? Are you going to observe? Are you going to use questionnaires? How will I get my data? And then how will I interpret my data? So if I'm doing a statistical analysis, what kind of validity tests, for example, am I going to do? If I'm using grounded theory, how am I going to interpret my data? So how do we get our data? We use measurement observation to collect the data. And we get two types, as we said earlier. You get your primary, which is your raw data that's collected from the original source. And you can do this in either a controlled or an uncontrolled environment. A controlled environment is usually experimental research where certain variables are being controlled by the researcher. Whereas an uncontrolled environment is when you collect your data through observation, or you do surveys or questionnaires or interviews, and you do these in a natural setting. In other words, where you will find your subject usually. Secondary data is that data that we get from secondary sources such as journals and books and documents, etc. Our main methods of data depends on the kind of data that we discover. And so we get data in either words or in numbers. And the kind of data we have, so if it's words or numbers, dictates the research approach that we follow. There's three main approaches. The qualitative approach is when you're dealing with data that tends to be verbal. The quantitative approach is where your data is numerical. And the mixed method is where you have a study where you use both qualitative and quantitative methods to answer various sub-questions. When we're looking at our qualitative methods, the important thing to understand about whether you qualitative research is that it is about the experienced qualities of a phenomena. So it deals with subjective data, and it's usually presented in words. And we use flexible and explorative methods to do our qualitative research design. So you will have semi-structured or open-ended interviews, for examples. The purpose of qualitative design is to reach a deeper understanding, and it can take an insider's view, so the researcher becomes part of the study itself, and it deals with the fact that nature is dynamic and changeable. It's also important with qualitative methods that we consider many different sources of data, which is very important for the validity of our findings. Usually with qualitative methods we're dealing with small samples, but they are studied in depth. Quantitative methods, on the other hand, is where we look at the measurable qualities of a phenomenon. So instead of the experience qualities, it's the measurable qualities. And we're dealing with abstractions of reality because we want to get to fundamental laws of nature, things that are generally applicable. So we look at our objective data that consists of numbers, and we do this in a detached and objective viewpoint. It's not subjective data. We also use structured methods with very limited flexibility because we want to keep our conditions as stable as possible, so that there's as few as possible nuisance variables that come into play, so that we can determine causal aspects. And we tend with quantitative methods to control our variables in a structured setting. And the focus in quantitative research is about the reliability of the data. Therefore, we use large samples and we test our results based on statistical significance. So what do we mean with validity and reliability of data? Validity basically means that we've used the right tool for the job. So it's the extent to which a measuring instrument measures what it's supposed to be measured. So, for example, you won't measure the length of a person or the height of a person with a scale. You would use a measuring tape. The reliability means that we've used a consistent tool, so we can repeat our findings using the exact same tool. So it's the consistency with which a measuring instrument yields a certain result when the entity being measured has not changed. So we always know that if we use this instrument, it would provide a certain result to us. Reliability is necessary, but it is not a sufficient condition for validity. So, how do we determine the validity of findings? Our validity depends, or we have to understand that validity represents what is really happening in the situation. So, it's the extent to which the findings represent what is really happening. So, is it really true? And there are a number of things that undermines validity, such as our faulty procedures, or if you don't measure accurately, or if you have poor samples. If you have only 5 people out of a sample group of 100 for which you send out questionnaires actually answered those questionnaires, you've got a poor sample and your findings would not be valid. You could have had a number of questionnaires where people only completed a part of the questionnaire, and that would also influence the validity of your findings. So to improve our validity, we use triangulations. This is particularly important when we are dealing with qualitative research, because we don't deal with exact and abstract things like numbers. So what do we mean with triangulation? Is we measure or we observe in different ways, and then we see if the findings support each other. So you would use, for example, focus groups, interviews, and desktop research. And out of these 3 things, you can see if the same picture starts emerging. The reliability of the findings has to do with the credibility of the findings, and whether we can trust the findings, will they stand up to scrutiny, and if we can repeat the findings. And if we know that somebody else can do the exact same study using the exact same tools and they will get the exact same findings, we know that our data is reliable and our findings is reliable. To help us with our methodology, we have a number of research techniques. So these are not research methodology. They are the methods or the techniques or the tools that you would use within a particular methodological tradition. And that is what we will be discussing in our last part of theme